Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, here we are, Memorial Day weekend. A special thanks to veterans and their families for the service that they provided our country, keeping us safe and secure. What a program we have. We're going to weigh in on last week's municipal elections. I think that's the way to put it. And we're going to get an update from the Secretary of Corrections on those reforms that were enacted a year ago, maybe 6 months ago in some cases. All of that following these words.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Hi, well, welcome back. As always, joining me, as I'm happy to say, as often is the case, two great reporters. They cover state politics. One of them has deserted the journalistic corps. He's a Patriots, PennLive's Editorial Page Editor. I joke with you about that, yes. John Micek, don't I? John does a wonderful job. Read his blog. I get up every morning and read it. Give us the name of it.
Capital Notebook.
Capital Notebook. It's a wonderful blog. And Brad Bumsted, he's a columnist as well. He covers the Capitol for the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. Brad, speaking of veterans, and in this case a Marine, one of the Bonus Gate convicted, I hate to use the word criminals, but let's just say convicted lawmakers in Bonus Gate is trying to get an ORI released, and that would be?
And that would be ex-Marine and ex-House Speaker Bill DeWeese. His case was before the Superior Court this week, before a panel of judges. It could be overturned. It's a conviction of theft, 5 felony counts. But here's the rub. He's served 13 months already. It may be 3 more months until there's a decision. Yeah. If he gets a new trial awarded, the Attorney General's office has to decide whether it's worth it to go after him when he's already going to have served 16 to 17 months. If he does win, he gets out, and he could run again for office.
Oh, my. Former Speaker of the House. John Micek, let's turn to these elections. And something real. First of all, it's in general. I want to come to Harrisburg. You were all over that story. And, you know, something that happened to one of the candidates who didn't win. But before I do that, I got calls from your colleagues all over the state. Low turnout, no interest, offices unfilled, no primary opponents. The AP said 20% overall turnout. I was reading 14, 15. Give us your take on that.
I mean, these are midterm elections, right? So I mean, and all that's on the they're not even midterm. I mean, these are off-year elections. Right. They're mostly obscure kind of municipal races. There's real, in general, sort of, unless you're really plugged in, these are low information races. People go into the booth and they basically throw a dart. They don't really know who they're voting for, unless you're like in a really marquee place. And we can talk about Pittsburgh and right. Mayoral races in Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. We were talking before we came on here about 14-15% in the Lehigh Valley.
And a big election where there was in one county up there,
a new
right?
mayor in the city of Bethlehem up there. It's kind of a crummy day on Tuesday too, a little rainy, a little gross. I mean, that has a little bit to do with it. But I think, in general, these are kind of low information races. About as marquee as it gets statewide was a Superior Court race, for goodness sake. So, there wasn't a lot out there.
I have trouble remembering. Yeah, but look, I used to say when I taught government Brad, how important these were. I mean, your safety, your security, your the streets and city. I mean, you can go through the list of things, how important it is, yet people tend to know, unless there's a NIMBY effect, right? Unless something, go ahead.
I think it's arguable that mayoral races and city council races have more impact on your life than state legislature or congressional races. And we had 2 important races this year in Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. I can talk about the one in Pittsburgh where Bill Peduto, a city councilman who was the nemesis of the previous mayor, Luke Ravenstall, who got in some hot water and stepped out of the race, defeated Jack Wagner. Now, that's significant because Jack Wagner had been the state auditor general, before that a state senator, and before that president of city council. Wagner had parachuted in late to try to win. Peduto had been out there for a year and a half beforehand, and he beat him pretty handily.
Yeah. Notice, we'll come back to that. John, let's quickly review. I want to do these 2, obviously, marquee in the sense that they represent big cities, but there's lots of other important elections. I don't want to diminish these other elections at all. But let's talk about Harrisburg. I mean, Mayor Thompson, very controversial, a governing style that was, to say the least, a little erratic. I'll be kind. a personality that just simply, I'll be candid, offended some people. She did have her supporters, to be true. Give us an update on that. And we even had an arrest. I mean, it's a little unusual to have an arrest during the course of a campaign by one of the people running.
I mean, this is a race of great symbolic importance. Let's put it that way. I mean, Harrisburg is not a big city in the way Pittsburgh is a big city, but it's the capital city of Pennsylvania. About 49,000 people in the population. It's in Act 47 protection. It's $370 million in debt. It's become sort of a national, international case study for what happens when municipal finances just go hopelessly awry. So, as you said, Linda Thompson, the incumbent mayor serving 4 years, was defeated on last Tuesday night, by Eric Pappenfuse, a bookshop owner here in town. We're in Harrisburg, a really contentious race, really hard fought, a four-way primary that also included the city controller, Dan Miller, who'd been a nemesis of Thompson for a long time, and a guy named Lewis Butts, sort of this community activist kind of gadfly guy, who actually got busted the day before the election for defacing Pappenfuse's signs.
And he did it himself. He didn't have somebody else go and deface him.
I
Right?
talked to him about it on Monday night before the election, and he said it was in retaliation for Pappenfuse people defacing his and removing his own signs. And it was just, the guy actually walked into Ed Marsica, the DA's office here in Dauphin County, and confessed to it, which was just extraordinary.
Oh, man. Only in politics. Now, maybe we've had this going on. We're going to run to a break. I want to get a quick review from these guys about the legislature and sort of the big issues. We're now going to push on something like a month and a week left before they try to get home for the summer holidays. They want to get the budget done by June 30. They got a lot of big agenda items. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation, educating citizens and business leaders about important public policy issues and civic affairs. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by BetterSaferRoads.com. To voice your support for safer highways and less traffic congestion, visit BetterSaferRoads.com. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Welcome back with Brad Bumsted and John Micek, two of the state's leading reporters. These guys have been covering Pennsylvania politics and government for several decades. Before we move on, you reminded me we don't want to end these elections. There's still general elections to go. Go ahead, Brad. What's in Pittsburgh? What's the story there?
Well, there's you face a possibility of an independent candidate. It's not clear yet. Same in Harrisburg. I believe Nevin Midland is independent.
Yeah. There's still more than 400 Republican votes, write-ins that are uncounted, so maybe Republican candidate too. We'll see.
All right, but the big point is, I mean, you've got these cities with huge Democratic majorities. They typically elect Democrats. If we were talking about rural parts of the state, we'd be talking about Republicans winning. We're not being partisan here. And, hopefully there's good contest. We all want competition. You guys all agree with that.
Yes.
All right, Brad, let me start with you on this. When the legislature comes back, they're off this week. They'll come back in the beginning of June. They have 30 days. They've got a huge agenda out there. And the question is, well, first of all, we got liquor privatization. We have roads and bridges, the transportation funding. We have pensions. They're probably the trio of the big issues. Where does this all stand now in general terms? Can they get something done? And they have to do the budget. Go ahead.
Well, I had a recent column about it that said it's a mega deal or nothing. We're going to get it all or none, because there's no way the transportation revenue bill, which the Senate wants, is going to be passed by the House unless the Senate passes a liquor bill. Now, they may not put that in writing. They may say it's not a deal. They may say there's no linkage. But it's hard to see how either side would accept the other's top priority without some kind of arrangement.
Yeah, but John, a deal is a deal is a deal, but there doesn't appear in the Senate to be a lot of support for complete privatization of alcohol, right?
No.
And over in the House, there doesn't appear to be a lot of support for spending you pick the figure, 1.8 billion or 2.5 billion to fix roads. Where do you think that all goes?
I read Brad's column, so I concur with his analysis. I mean, they might get out of here on midnight on June 30th with just a budget in hand. I mean, it's entirely possible. I mean, the problem is in the House, you have a lot of conservative Republicans who are tax averse, who don't want to pass new fees and registration increases on motorists. In the Senate, you have a substantial cadre of the Republican leaders who really don't want to privatize the system. You start asking them about privatization, they start saying modernization. That means keeping the existing system and making it more flexible. So what does that mean? Maybe that means wine and beer in the supermarkets in the final analysis, and maybe letting beer distributors sell six-packs. But a completely privatized system, it's appearing increasingly unlikely.
All of this takes place in the midst of what looks like could be a $500 million deficit in the state budget this year, meaning on balance, they end up in the hole $500 million based on their plans to spend. The governor wants to raise the state's overall budget by 2.4%, if I remember that correctly. Is there any consensus yet on the budget, or do you think they just sort of tweak what the governor recommended, no big changes? What's your sense about that?
It's hard to tweak with $500 million. A couple $100 million maybe you can tweak, but it starts getting serious at that point. But there are two big issues out there that affect this. One is whether they expand Medicaid or not under Obamacare. If they do, it brings in some say about $185 million to take off of that $500 million. And the other is pension reform. If they pass Corbett's pension reform plan, it would bring in $150 million maybe, which would again offset the 500. But there seems to be very little support for the pension reform.
But John, I have not heard much in the way of, there are concerns about various aspects of the budget. As you covered this for years, you know that. Groups say, well, you're cutting too much. The special education funding in particular has been on the drawing board. There's a new commission. But typically, would you expect for the folks out there big changes to what the governor recommended this year, wholesale changes?
Well, I mean, if they have to find $500 million in revenue to close that, you'll see stuff getting moved around. I mean, but when you start talking about like the marquee accounts, public schools, public welfare, those are two of the three biggest chunks in the budget, and there's not really very many places to go in those two agencies that haven't been hit already. So then you start talking about, Brad can talk about this better than me, but a decimal point here or a decimal point there within the budget, trying to find those numbers and making everything work. And the governor's initial budget plan was based on different revenue assumptions. So now we're in this different place.
All right, great update. All right, coming up, the Pennsylvania Secretary of Corrections, John Wetzel. There were some concerns about the recidivism rate in coming out of state prisons. We're going to talk a little bit about prison reform and where all of that stands after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education. 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, thanks and welcome back. Joining me is John Wetzel. He's the Pennsylvania Secretary of Corrections. There's lots of debates about accomplishments by the legislature and the governor's office. Here and there, I think the reforms by consensus passed by the legislature, now being implemented by the secretary who's sitting across from me, generally considered to be a success. We're going to find out how successful and what problems remain. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to have you. Listen, here's the setting. 50 or so thousand people in Pennsylvania's corrections, deep concern about the high recidivism rate. The legislature passes some reform measures. aimed at reducing that, more on rehabilitation. Do I got that right so far?
Yeah, generally.
Okay. Now, specifically, what did the legislature say that they wanted you to do as head of the corrections in that legislation that was passed in two separate times over the last couple of years?
Yeah, the legislation, two-part legislation. Right. First part really looked at restructuring our system. So it took the first steps to really identify who should come to a state prison. And probably for the first time in the history of Pennsylvania, the focus is now becoming outcomes in corrections. And it sounds ridiculous that in 2013, I'd say for the first time we're looking at outcomes. But historically, with criminal justice and with corrections in particular, we generally think if somebody's doing something wrong, let's throw them in a prison and we'll get a good outcome. When you look at our numbers, that's not the case.
Because they return.
They return. When you send the wrong people and when you don't have the programs in the prison and the follow-up out of the prison to elicit good results. So what this legislation does, it restructured our community correction system, which are generally halfway houses, of which we have 54 state halfway houses in Pennsylvania. And oh, by the way, our halfway house system costs about $110 million. In spite of that investment, what we found in 2009 under the Rendell administration, they did a study on the halfway house system, found that 95% of those halfway house programs were actually increasing the potential future crime of the offenders in the system.
Are you serious?
Could I make that up?
I mean, we have a program at 95% failure rate. Is that what you're saying to me?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yet and still, nothing really changed after that. This legislation empowered us to restructure that entire system. And from day one of the Corbett administration, Governor Corbett, my charge was, let's focus on outcomes. Let's stop talking about even the term recidivism, which is the rate at which people return. You know, it's a word, it's hard to spell even. You know, nobody knows. People can't say. People say recidivism and all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, if somebody's getting out and they're going to move in your neighborhood, and when you look at 20,000 people coming in, 20,000 people getting out, the chances that someone in your neighborhood or someone you know comes out of a state prison gets greater and greater every day. What do you care about? What you care about is that they come out less likely to commit a crime.
Right.
A piece of that, when someone has been removed from society for a period of time and we haven't completely addressed all their needs, is that we need a halfway house system that actually focuses on addressing the remaining needs so they can be crime-free. And so we did, the legislation allowed us to restructure it, identify who goes there, but then...
Yeah, I want to pursue that.
Okay.
I mean, I think you're onto a key point. So someone's been convicted of a crime, they get a jail sentence. Your job then is to figure out the best course of action to make sure when they're released, they don't go back and commit the same crime or commit another crime, whatever. And what's that involve?
Well, it starts at the front end, and it starts with sending the right people to us. Again, 2008, there was a legislation passed, and that reform goes in quotes. I think the reform that passed this time is legitimate reform. Right. That reform enabled the Sentencing Commission to develop a risk-based sentencing tool. So imagine this groundbreaking stuff we're doing. So a judge who's getting ready to sentence someone will have information on what risk this individual presents. In many cases, that's not the case now.
Right.
So it really focused on the risk and needs, but that wasn't funded until this year, until 2012.
Right.
So that tool is being developed to make sure that the judges have all the information to make the best decision. Send people to us who we can help.
Okay. All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, we're going to continue to pursue this topic. I think it's an important one, not just in money, but in human lives and the potential for future crime. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Hi, welcome back. I'm chatting with John Wetzel. He's the Pennsylvania Secretary of Corrections, where he's getting into the details of this prison reform, which is, I think, hugely important to the state. Now, I interrupted you by a commercial break. You were about to talk about performance-based corrections reform, something pretty new. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, again, Governor Corbett came in. He said, we need to focus on outcomes in this system. So in halfway house system in particular, with the failure rate we had, we really looked hard and we did something that may be unique. Is we looked internally and said, well, what are we screwing up? And we weren't sending the right people to the right halfway houses. We weren't necessarily putting people in halfway houses in their community. And when you talk about community corrections, that community means their community, not some community halfway across the state. So we kind of cleaned up our act, but then we contract we have 54 community correction centers, 48 of which are contracted. I'm sorry, 38 of which are contracted. So we rebid the whole system. And in those contracts, we have a performance measure. And it simply states that we expect you to reduce the future criminality of the offenders who come to you. That's what we're paying you for. Right. And I inspected each one of these centers unannounced myself, and what would drive me nuts is I'd walk into a center and there'd be a bunch of guys laying around watching Jerry Springer. Well, we're not paying $50, $60, $70 a day to some vendor to let somebody watch Jerry Springer on the taxpayer dollars. So we put a performance measure and we said, we expect you to reduce the future criminality. We're gonna measure it. We established a baseline. And so a year after, we're going to look, and the people who got out of here, we expect their recidivism rate at least not to be lower, at least not to be higher.
Higher, right.
If it's higher, you go into probation, and if it's higher in 2 successive periods, you're in deep trouble.
How long before you get a real sense about whether this is working or not?
The new system structure will start the July 1st of 13.
July
so
1st of
you figure
this
a
year.
for it to be operating, and then we can measure, because you want everybody to be out a year to get a true measure of the recidivism.
And
so
it may
2 years
take actually longer. I mean, you know how that works. No, but you think you'll
Listen,
be getting
that's not a mindset that I'm familiar with.
I like that.
We need to get results.
Like that approach.
We invest, $2 billion of taxpayer dollars goes to corrections. And if we were getting great outcomes, spend it. If we need that much money to ensure the public safety, spend it. But we don't. So we need to turn our system into one that we expect outcomes. When you go to you expect outcomes from your doctor.
Sure.
If your doctor said that, hey, 4 out of 10 times you're going to die if you do this procedure, would you do the procedure? No, you'd find a new doctor. But that's our success rate. In corrections, we say, only 40% of the people end up back in 3 years, and we brag about that. That's nothing to brag about. The reality is there's a large enough body of research right now that tells us what can be effective. So we need to switch our system to, first of all, expect results, expect a return on that investment, and then deliver it. And we don't have time to wait. We're in a bad budget time nationally. And so if we can have an area like corrections where we can improve our practices and really take some of the, we make decisions in criminal justice on emotion. So something bad happens, I guarantee 10 legislators are going to introduce Fluffy's Law, right?
Gotta go. Look, this was a wonderful update. We'll see you next week. Stay well. Another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers.